I would like to introduce to you Ed Harrington, who is a research fellow at the Center for Security Studies in Zurich. So, Ed, if I can ask you to start with the first presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hello everyone, and thank you so much for being here today, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation to come and share my perspective on these issues with you. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the vision of a world free of nuclear weapons. From its inception, nuclear strategy has been a profoundly ahistorical field. Only recently have scholars begun to mine the wealth of evidentiary data that was created during the Cold War. And mining that data has revolutionary potential. Providing an evidentiary basis against which to test theories of nuclear deterrence and nonproliferation holds out the possibility of reinvigorating what's become a rather stale intellectual debate. But it also holds out the possibility of really fundamentally reconfiguring what we believe to be true about nuclear deterrence. And this is partly because theories of nuclear deterrence are prospective in nature. They're based on game theoretic models which predict what people will do in the future. But really, at the time that deterrence theory came into being, they were much a repudiation of everything that had come before. They were a repudiation of the history of arms racing and the belief that was very prevalent at the time that arms races, in fact, led to war. So, as scholars close the gap between theory and practice, what worked about Cold War era nuclear deterrence theory, and possibly more importantly why it worked, are likely to be replaced with updated ideas that take into account connections that could not be discovered through deductive analysis alone. And there are a lot of people who are doing really interesting historical work in this area. The name Frank Gavin comes to mind. There are also people who are doing work that is data-driven. So Matt Kroenig on the panel today would be one of the people who's doing this kind of work, which I consider really revolutionary. There's also another kind of intellectual project going on that's using this kind of data. It's the project of writing an alternative history of the nuclear age by recovering information about the economic and environmental and human costs associated with maintaining a nuclear arsenal. So these are stories of accidents, near misses, unaccounted costs that were intentionally or unintentionally obscured during the Cold War under the cloak of national security. So here I'm thinking of Eric Schlosser's Command and Control, Stephen Schwartz's Atomic Audit, Joe Masco's Nuclear Borderlands, Judy Pasternak's Yellow Dirt. These are all histories that provide reasons to reduce the number of nuclear weapons, not because deterrence may fail and result in a nuclear war, but because even if deterrence succeeds, there are still significant costs that justify looking beyond a Cold War era narrative about nuclear deterrence and finding a safer alternative. So at the same time, tethering theories of nuclear deterrence to the past could weigh progress down. That same data could also prove to be a really conservative force. Insofar as beliefs about what is possible in the future are determined by what we believe we already know through our experience, this could have the potential to limit thinking about the future of nuclear policy, and in particular thinking about the future of nuclear disarmament. So perhaps it's only by setting aside the lessons of the past that the path to a world free of nuclear weapons comes into view. Arguably, this is the lesson that could be learned from the history of the Cold War. As I've already talked about, this is the history in which deterrence theorists set aside what came before in order to talk meaningfully about nuclear deterrence as the solution to what to do with the possibility of nuclear annihilation. So the question that I want to address today is, how do we grab hold of the revolutionary potential of the knowledge now available to us without becoming imprisoned within the boundaries of the past? And I think the answer to this is in the power of the vision. It's in the power to see past what has been blocking us in our debate. And this question is particularly salient with respect to the future of nuclear disarmament. What I'm going to argue is that the future of a world free of nuclear weapons is already observable in the foreign policy practices of non-nuclear weapon states today. Rather than having to imagine what this future of a disarmed world might look like, we can actually look at what states that have chosen not to proliferate are doing in order to learn more about what actually might work in the future. So what I want to suggest is, before I put up this picture, right? This is the picture, the top of the mountain, the mountaintop that we can't see. This is the sort of rhetoric of the Four Horsemen, George Shultz, Bill Perry, Sam Nunn, and Henry Kissinger. And this is their, you know, we can't see the top of the mountain, but we need to keep climbing. I want to suggest instead that it looks more like a road that goes on infinitely. And right now we're sitting and we're staring at the edge and we're saying, practitioners are saying, we want to get down there, but we don't know how to climb down. How do we make it to the next level? And this is where I think that academics and theory can come into play, right? Because we aren't beholden to the same level of talking about necessity as practitioners are. We're free to dream a little bit, and a lot of what we do is use more abstract language, much the way a mathematician might use numbers. You translate ideas into numbers, and then you do statistical analysis, and that creates connections that you wouldn't be able to see in the absence of having done that connection. So academics do something similar. Either they do it with numbers or they do it with language. We translate things into very abstract language so that we can create connections that you wouldn't be able to see by looking at the concrete things on the surface, right? However, I'm just going to leave all of that abstract language out of my presentation for you today, and I'm going to talk immediately just about nuclear deterrence. So what's come up already a lot in the morning is that there's sort of two different ideas of how to go about thinking what is nuclear deterrence. The first is deterrence by punishment. And that's the prevention of action by the existence of a credible threat of unacceptable counteraction. And the second is deterrence by denial, right? This is a different mechanism. It's the belief that the cost of action outweighs the perceived benefits. What I'm going to argue today is that we also need to think of deterrence as a kind of system. And this is a very Schelling-esque way of thinking about the definition of deterrence. Thomas Schelling talked about deterrence as the diplomacy of violence. So deterrence, both deterrence by punishment and deterrence by denial, can be thought of as a system of interaction through which states trade on the possession of the implements of violence to achieve outcomes not achievable through the application of that violence alone. So, right, so it's a way of connecting the realm of military violence to the realm of power and diplomacy. So implicit in these definitions is a distinction between absolute value and relative value, right? So relative value is the threat, right? The threat only works if somebody is holding the idea of having something destroyed relative to the outcome they could have, right? So famously, we talk about relative value in a deterrence context, in the MAD, mutually assured destruction context, as being willing to trade Chicago for Hamburg, right? That would be relative value. Absolute value is just this, right? This is a picture of Hiroshima. This is what nuclear weapons do. This is their, how you would measure what they can do with an explosive yield, right? If you actually consume them, what do they produce? This, I would argue, is relative or exchange value. It involves a lot of bottled water. This is a picture from the table in Austria of the nuclear negotiations. In all seriousness, it is, I chose this as a demonstration of actually the action of what happens, but it is basically connecting the realm of military violence to the realm of diplomacy and keeping it there. So there's another realm in which absolute and exchange value or relative value operate, right? And that's the realm of commodity exchange, okay? So in the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which is a place where they exchange futures on things like hogs, there's always a joke that the traders make, right? Which is, you don't want to make a bad trade because you're going to end up with a truck of hogs. It used to be that you'd end up with a truck of pig bellies, but they don't trade those anymore. So absolute value is the hogs arriving on your doorstep, right? That's not what any of these traders want. That's not what they're in the business of. The traders are in the business of extracting relative value out of actually making the transactions. There's something else that's really particular about nuclear weapons that chemical weapons, biological weapons, other type of weaponry does not share in common. Nuclear weapons are scarce. All currencies are scarce, right? They're either naturally scarce or we make them scarce. You know, the government has all sorts of ways of ensuring that currency doesn't get duplicated. So this is a picture of Ahmadinejad viewing the uranium enrichment plant. It's from a few years ago. In any case, this is one of the bottlenecks. For this audience, I'm not going to talk about what the bottlenecks are in producing this material. But the fact that it's scarce is important to maintain its value for trading within diplomatic contexts. Nuclear weapons are also durable. So the stuff of nuclear weapons is incredibly difficult to produce. But once you have it, it does not go away. In fact, it sticks around for longer than the human imagination can entirely conceive of. That said, putting it into a warhead format and then onto a delivery vehicle is something that a lot of people have put a lot of effort into making sure this is going to work properly. Kind of like the US Mint puts a lot of effort into making sure that the US money supply stays current, right? We don't really care very much about that at the level of consumers. We just care that we have the currency and we can trade it. There's a similar dynamic that happens. The US and the Soviet, or Russia, put a lot of effort into maintaining their arsenals. That doesn't really matter that much for the process of exchange. It does matter maybe for the details of agreements, but for this appearance of how we actually interact with the substance of nuclear weapons, for all intents and purposes, they're incredibly durable. So the suggestion here is that the way we find a ladder to climb kind of from one plateau to another would be to actually understand and theorize and talk meaningfully about this connection. Deterrence doesn't need to end at the point that diplomacy begins. We actually need to do what was done in the world of economic currencies. The idea of, for instance, going off the gold standard was always considered to be grave folly. That happened 40 years ago? But the idea is that what you want to do is you want to pay more attention to the scarcity and durability. These are social and material factors. This isn't a less materialist argument. You want to emphasize those and you want to reduce the capacity for destruction, right? You want to emphasize that the value of nuclear weapons is actually in this diplomatic realm that they open up and make possible. Okay, so quickly, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Iran. So I said at the beginning, I think that you can already see states doing this, and non-nuclear weapon states in particular. And I think Iran, by not mistaking violence for power, actually had the upper hand throughout most of the negotiations vis-a-vis the US. In the US, we tend to think violence is power. Conceptually, I think that's really misleading, and it actually handicaps the way that we approach these processes. So if you look at Iran's strategy, I would argue that they have a strategy of deterrence by denial. They want to increase the costs of attack and they want to reduce the benefits. So President Rouhani's plan had 5 points in it. They're up on this slide. I don't really have time to go through it all. But some of these points were about increasing the costs of attacking, and some of these points are about reducing the benefits. And one of the reasons they're successful in the negotiations is that they convinced the US that even if the US did bomb, it's reminding you what the distinction is, they would keep going at their program, right? So Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Martin Dempsey, for instance, in an interview with Fareed Zakaria, at one point says, yeah, well, but the problem is you can destroy it, but that's only going to set them back. It's not going to stop them, right? So the other thing I want to point out about this isn't a norms-based argument. This is actually an argument that still includes force. In terms of military strategies, Iran had a pretty complex military strategy for deterring attack on its nuclear facilities. It involved where they located their uranium enrichment plants, beefing up their anti-aircraft defenses, leaning on asymmetric threats, so regional terrorism, cyber attacks, and also the threat of closing the Strait of Hormuz, right, which would be a really big deal. So this manipulation of deterrence by denial always has in the background the threat of punishment, right? The threat of nuclear annihilation is always lurking. And I put up this slide because, the US was constantly in, and not only the US, other powers as well, were constantly putting out new estimates of when it was that Iran was going to have a bomb. Well, interestingly, Iran made its own estimate. And this slide was up on this nuclearenergy.ir site for a very short time, after which the entire site got taken down. And I think it's so interesting because, from an engineering perspective or a scientist perspective, saying, no, the US estimates are wrong. Actually, see, we've done the real estimate of when we would get a bomb. Diplomatically is a terrible thing to do if you're in the business of saying that you're absolutely under no circumstances going to get a bomb. So, but the point is that both sides acknowledge that in the background this threat of punishment is still lurking in this recessed sense. So it's not that deterrence by denial works without deterrence by punishment. It's just that deterrence by denial takes the front seat and deterrence by punishment takes the back seat. So I was really hoping that they would conclude a deal. This theory, it has more layers to it, which I'm not going to share to you today. But I work on it with an Iranian national, and she and I went out and celebrated the day that the deal was concluded, because it was very important for the success of the theory that Iran actually successfully trade and conclude a deal on nuclear, conclude a nuclear agreement in order to move forward. So I think that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Anne. Our next speaker will be Matthew Kroenig, who is an associate professor at the Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. So, Matt, if I can ask you on the stage.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here in such a beautiful city. It's my first time to Prague, and in such a beautiful conference room. It's really a pleasure and an honor. In my remarks today, I'm going to talk about a possible tension between U.S. plans to modernize its nuclear forces and President Obama's stated commitment of working toward a world without nuclear weapons. And I'm going to argue that the United States is right to pursue the thoroughgoing modernization of its nuclear forces. So my childhood dream was to star in the National Basketball Association. I wanted to be the next Michael Jordan. But I'm only 6 feet 1 inch tall, which is fairly tall in the real world, but not for an NBA basketball player. I'm in my late 30s. I haven't played basketball competitively in 15 years. So my chances of playing professionally at this point are basically zero. But some might argue if I'm ever going to achieve my boyhood wish, I should stop what I'm doing and spend my days practicing, shooting free throws, running wind sprints. But even doing that would improve my chances only a little bit, and it would certainly take away from the life that I currently have as a researcher, a professor, and an analyst. So in the end, it simply isn't worth ruining the life I have in order to chase a fantasy. And I think the same can be said about US nuclear modernization. Over the next decade and beyond, the United States will go through a much-needed modernization of its aging nuclear capabilities, and these plans enjoy strong bipartisan support in Washington. But some critics argue that the modernization project conflicts with stated disarmament goals, like President Obama's promise to work toward a world without nuclear weapons. The fact is, however, that the world is characterized by intense security competition and sometimes outright conflict. Some observers hope that the end of the Cold War would lead to an end of history, but we haven't seen that. Russia has violently occupied Crimea and invaded the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, and continues to menace the rest of Ukraine and Europe, makes nuclear threats, has recently violated the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, testing a new intermediate-range ground-launched cruise missile. Moscow is also building new nuclear ICBMs, bombers, and submarines. And unlike the West and unlike the United States, has actually moved nuclear weapons to the center of its military strategy and doctrine. China is also asserting revisionist territorial claims in East Asia. Its conventional military buildup threatens to overturn the military balance that has kept the peace in East Asia for over a half-century. A peace that's probably benefited China more than any other state. China is also expanding and modernizing its nuclear forces. And though Beijing trumpets a formal no-first-use policy, its officials admit in private that there are a narrow range of contingencies under which the Chinese might be willing to use nuclear weapons first. Over the past 2 decades, conventional military dominance of the West and of the United States has allowed the United States to de-emphasize nuclear weapons in its national security strategy. The foes we faced, like Al-Qaeda, Afghanistan, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, didn't have nuclear weapons, so nuclear weapons were less relevant to our strategies with regard to those powers. But great power political competition is returning, and the United States once again has, and NATO once again has, nuclear-armed foes that threaten our interests. Washington's potential adversaries, Russia, China, and North Korea, are again modernizing their nuclear arsenals with an eye toward using those weapons in the event of a major conflict with the United States. This is the reality. Nonetheless, some argue that achieving our fond hope of complete nuclear disarmament requires the United States to cut its arsenal and refuse to modernize its nuclear forces. But if Washington pursued this course, other countries would not blindly follow our lead, and I think we've seen that over the past few years as the United States has de-emphasized nuclear weapons. Other countries have moved in the opposite direction, relying more, not less, on nuclear weapons. So complete nuclear disarmament may be desirable, but achieving it will require nothing less than a major transformation of the international system, really eradicating the root causes of international insecurity. If we look historically, the largest nuclear reductions came at the end of the Cold War, when the hostilities of the Cold War ceased, nuclear drawdowns followed. So I think looking forward to the future, if we wanted even more radical reductions, complete nuclear disarmament, it would require a radical reduction of international tension and international conflict. So those who argue that by making change to our nuclear posture, by failing to modernize our nuclear forces, that somehow this will lead to disarmament, I think risk confusing cause and effect. To be sure, all states should work to reduce international tensions so that disarmament might be achieved in the future. And if and when security threats are reduced sufficiently, nuclear drawdowns will easily follow. But in the meantime, simply allowing the United States nuclear arsenal to rust away will not meaningfully affect chances for eliminating nuclear weapons worldwide. Moreover, failure to modernize would not only not contribute to disarmament, it would be dangerous and irresponsible. A crippled U.S. nuclear arsenal would embolden enemies, frighten our allies, generate international instability, and undermine U.S. and international security. In other words, it would risk ruining the world that currently exists. Rather than preparing for an alternate reality, therefore, Washington needs to build the nuclear forces that it needs to deter threats to international peace and security in this reality, in the world we actually live in. This means maintaining a robust nuclear posture and fully modernizing nuclear forces as planned. This means upgrading all three legs of the nuclear triad, refurbishing nuclear warheads, modernizing the production complex, and if necessary, summoning the political will to build new capabilities to meet new threats. Some might argue that modernization in the United States will spur reactions in other states, contributing to a new arms race. But as I pointed out above, these modernization plans are going forward in other countries, quite apart from any decisions being made in Washington. Other critics would cite cost as an obstacle, that we spend a lot of money on nuclear weapons, but at modernization's peak, the nuclear upgrades will only account for around 5% of the US defense budget. So nuclear weapons provide a strategic deterrent at a reasonable price. In sum, there's no good reason for the United States not to follow through on its planned modernization of nuclear forces. Perhaps, and I hope that one day we'll be pleasantly surprised by an opportunity to live out our fantasies, but until then, we must live up to our responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bennett. Our next speaker is Harald Müller from the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt and Goethe University of Frankfurt, and he will tell us a bit about the relationship between deterrence and disarmament. Harald.
Thank you, Michal. I will speak from my seat. First of all, I'm handicapped, and secondly, if I would stand at the podium, you would see that I'm much shorter than all the other speakers. The relationship between deterrence and disarmament was very visible and audible during the 2015 NPT review. You could hear the nuclear weapon states uniformly say, we are living up to our Article 6 obligations because we are reducing and reducing and reducing. And you could hear the non-nuclear weapon states say, but you don't mean it, and therefore it's not nuclear disarmament. Now, that sounds like a puzzle, but that is easily dissolved. Nuclear deterrence and nuclear disarmament. Disarmament as a process that must inevitably result in a nuclear weapon-free world are principled opposites. They cannot live together, as little as Harry Potter and Lord Voldemort could live together. This opposition in principle is concealed by the coexistence, the temporary coexistence, the two might have in process. That means as long as deterrence is moving from abundant and excessive postures to more and more finite and minimalist ones, it can look like coexistence between disarmament and deterrence. But at one point, deterrence-minded governments will call stop. We have heard this call in New York this year from France in a rather high voice. That means that when further cuts or ancillary measures like the alerting compromise deterrence in the eyes of its pundits, coexistence comes to an end, and the principal opposition between deterrence and disarmament comes to the fore. Those of us who rather prefer nuclear disarmament to nuclear deterrence have thus to conceive of the disarmament process as a development in which the supposed security value of nuclear weapons must either be unlearned or being substituted for by other tools of security, or most likely both. This is in the end a political struggle, because not all pro-deterrence forces will be persuaded by better arguments. One of the seeming possibilities to escape this basic contradiction is virtual deterrence, which has been praised by some as the end state of nuclear disarmament, which preserves deterrence. I think that virtual deterrence is a non-starter. The whole mentality of nuclear deterrence, the bureaucratic, technical, and military apparatuses are kept alive, and with them their political influence. Deterrence is not just a rational strategy framed in the frame of rational choice. Deterrence is a social, political, cultural complex. a hegemonic discourse with debatable background assumptions and a well-entrenched power structure. And I think that our colleague Rory this morning has demonstrated an important part where this power structure is residing. Reconstitution races, which are no trouble in a de-alerting world because of nuclear deterrence abundancy, are a heavy destabilization risk in a virtual deterrence world because of the premium of the first successful reconstitution. And this possibility will loom very large and highly destabilizing because the reconstitution apparatuses will be there in all former nuclear weapon states. That is indeed a nightmare of instability, and I think Thomas Schelling has demonstrated that pretty good in a 2008 article. And in order to avoid that nightmare of instability, the governments and security elites of nuclear weapon states would prefer the status quo, that is, real deterrence based on physical nuclear weapons, to the pipe dream of virtual deterrence. Disarmament will not happen, and the relationship of opposition will once more be confirmed. For this reason, virtual deterrence can only be a temporary, very short-lived transition phase from low nuclear number postures to effective zero. And effective zero means that the infrastructure for reconstitution is also abolished as far as possible. This means, of course, that in the process, nuclear deterrence must be replaced by other security tools. At the military level, agreed arms control and national armament restraints as great power norms would have to be reinvented. We had this idea long ago, but it has disappeared sometimes after the Cold War. Superiority has to be renounced in favor of balance and equal security. As long as one party is superior and clearly perceived as such by others, you will have arms racing, and certainly no one will rescind nuclear deterrence. Large-scale offensive options have to be built down. Again, that philosophy was existing in Europe when the CFE treaty was negotiated, but it has also evaporated. Cyber warfare has to be curbed. We heard Pat Morgan talking about it this morning. And countries would have to rely on robust conventional defenses, which is, by the way, the response I would wish to NATO, from NATO to the present Russian challenge, rather than placebos and a emphasis on extended nuclear deterrence. At the political level, waiving great power territorial claims and submitting them to mediation and adjudication in the long run will be indispensable. Two of the great powers that has been mentioned by Matt are pursuing territorial claims for great powers. That's bad policy, not the least because it has the inevitable consequence of propelling all those feeling threatened into alliances with other great powers. We see this dynamic right now in Europe and in East Asia. It's a march of folly. The principle of no unilateral use of force, which is enshrined in the United Nations Charter, has to be re-emphasized. And great powers must come to the point where they respect each other's vital interests, as the powers of the European concert did in the 19th century. In a true disarmament world, nuclear mentality would have to be replaced by non-nuclear security thinking. And that requires a very strong and systematic effort by non-nuclear weapon states and their civil society allies to work down the nuclear deterrence paradigm. This requires efforts at several fronts. One front is pursued by the humanitarian initiative that attacks the normative viability of nuclear weapons. It has clearly shown what we knew all along, but always put under the carpet. Nuclear weapons fall by all known standards in the category of inhumanitarian weapons that belong to the list of those to be banned, period. The notion that security can be achieved with non-nuclear means, military and even more so non-military ones, has to be promulgated perpetuously. Civil society, I should say in that context, has still to develop effective instruments to put pressure on autocratic governments. It does so very successfully in democracies, but where are the tools to do that with non-democracies? What we then have to envisage are three parallel processes of change. The nuclear weapons states have been existing for long, that nuclear disarmament down to zero needs changes of political conditions. Matt made the same point in his presentation, and I think they are right. And in that I'm a bit distinct from some of my NGO friends. The problem is that this position of the nuclear weapon states is revealed as a mere rhetorical ruse by the same nuclear weapon states preventing these conditions from emerging through their conventional armaments policies, through their arms exports, through their territorial claims, through their military maneuvers and operations against non-nuclear weapon states, and through their unmitigated rivalry for more or less meaningless regional influence. It's up to them to change behavior. So three parallel processes are needed on the road to nuclear disarmament. First, a process of successive steps at nuclear disarmament, plus ancillary measures. Second, a process of building up the political conditions to achieve security without nuclear weapons. And third, a process of self-education and re-education to replace the nuclear mentality with a non-nuclear mentality. And for the latter one, the fact that we have the UNGA resolution on non-proliferation and disarmament education, and have that also repeated by the 2010 NPT Review Conference is a very good start. And I want to emphasize that without any particular step in one of these processes being contingent on any specific step in another process, the progress of each process is contingent on progress in the others. And I just remind you of our unique experience in the second half of the 80s, when we saw landmark political changes and at the same time extremely significant progress in disarmament. It's very unlikely that the INF Treaty would have fallen, that without the INF Treaty the war would have fallen at any time. It was from both sides an absolutely significant signal given through nuclear disarmament of peaceful intentions by the Soviets through building down a much larger number of weapons, very new weapons, than we did, and for us to taking out the two weapon systems that have the greatest potential for enabling us to a decapitating strike. Let me just conclude by giving you a quote that exposes the inherent absurdity of nuclear deterrence in a funny way. It stems from the early 90s, after the first major debate in the House of Commons on the Trident succession. The BBC reporter was standing in front of Downing Street 10 and said the following words. Today, Prime Minister Major told the House of Commons that the Trident are needed to protect Britain against the unknown. How these weapons will protect Britain against the unknown is also unknown. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Harald. Our last speaker at this panel is Mort Wilson, who is a senior fellow and director of Rethinking Nuclear Weapons Project at BASIC. And the title of his presentation is Not If, But When.
Thank you. We cannot continue to rely on nuclear deterrence because we don't understand it, because it has failed in the past, and because it will inevitably fail in the future. You may think what's important about nuclear weapons is that they make big explosions. But nuclear believers say it's nuclear deterrence that matters. Deterrence, as I'm sure you know, is using a threat to dissuade an adversary from doing something, and threats go on inside the head. The difficulty is that it's hard to measure inside someone's head. Science is about measuring. Truth isn't objective unless you can measure it, test it, and other people can reproduce the results. But you can't measure psychological states of mind. Nuclear-armed states have tested nuclear weapons on more than 2,000 occasions in deserts and remote parts of the world. The physics of nuclear weapons is very well understood. But the physics is largely beside the point. The important question is not what does the explosion do on the ground? The important question is what does the explosion do in the minds of leaders? When I blow up your city, do you surrender? When I threaten to blow up your cities, do you back down? We have good evidence about what nuclear weapons do to buildings and cars and factories and people's bodies. We don't have good evidence for what they do in the minds of leaders. You can't get a ruler inside someone's head to measure their state of mind, even if you could, with some sort of advanced equipment in a lab. No one has ever measured leaders' minds during a crisis. So the first problem with nuclear deterrence, and it's a very serious problem, is that all of our evidence is subjective. Almost all claims about nuclear deterrence can't be proved in any objective scientific sense. The second problem has to do with deterrence failure. Some people argue that since our evidence is all subjective, we shouldn't assume that nuclear deterrence ever works. I may have been one of those people in the past myself. But I now don't believe that. I believe, and most serious observers believe, that even though we can't scientifically prove it, nuclear deterrence does work some of the time. I want to be sure you heard that. Deterrence works some of the time. It can prevent wars some of the time. It gives you diplomatic leverage some of the time. It's the ultimate guarantee of safety some of the time. But I would argue that if nuclear deterrence only works some of the time, you have to get rid of nuclear weapons. Because in order to be safe, nuclear deterrence has to work all of the time. The consequences of nuclear deterrence failure are unacceptable. Deterrence failure can lead to catastrophic all-out nuclear war. All-out nuclear war would mean at least 300 million people dead and civilization wrecked for centuries. Such an outcome is simply unacceptable. Even if the smallest risk of all-out nuclear war exists, then relying on nuclear deterrence is not an option, no matter what the benefits. People who promote nuclear weapons understand the imperative imposed by the enormous consequences of deterrence failure. As a result, they often argue that nuclear deterrence has worked. It has been perfect. They claim that in all the crises of the Cold War and a couple that came later, nuclear deterrence never failed. But there are reasons to be skeptical about this claim. If nuclear deterrence never failed, why did the US nuclear monopoly not prevent the Berlin blockade in 1948? If nuclear deterrence never failed, why did the Chinese join the Korean War in 1950? If nuclear deterrence never failed, how did the Israelis get attacked in 1973? If nuclear deterrence never failed, why did the Argentines attack the Falkland Islands in 1982? And so on. Clearly, nuclear deterrence has failed in the past. Nuclear believers say these are not failures. They can't be, because they didn't lead to nuclear war. But that's false reasoning. Just because things turned out okay doesn't mean you didn't make mistakes. It's possible, for example, to do something stupid behind the wheel of your car, to make what ought to be a fatal mistake, without ending up dead. Maybe the other guy swerves. Maybe there's a guardrail that keeps you from plunging off the road. Maybe, by sheer chance, there's a gap in the traffic coming the other way. You can make mistakes and still survive. So the fact that we've survived doesn't prove we haven't made mistakes. It doesn't prove deterrence works perfectly. It's possible to make what ought to be fatal foreign policy decisions without it ending in nuclear war. Perhaps the clearest and most hair-raising example of a fatal mistake that should have ended in nuclear war but didn't is the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy knew that if he blockaded Cuba, the crisis might spiral out of control. So many forces from so many different countries, so close together, so many opportunities for confrontation. Something could easily go wrong that would escalate step by step to massive devastation. In the private meetings in which they talked about the crisis, they mentioned the danger of nuclear war 58 times. They were clearly aware of this possibility. But despite his concerns, Kennedy went ahead anyway. Nuclear deterrence, fear of nuclear war, didn't restrain him. And his concern that things might get out of control turned out to be wholly justified. Things almost did get out of control a number of times. The scariest was on Saturday, October 27, 1962. At the height of the crisis, with the world on the brink of nuclear holocaust, an American U-2 spy plane flying over the North Pole malfunctioned and strayed off course and ended up 300 miles inside the Soviet Union. The Soviets scrambled MiGs to shoot it down. The United States scrambled F-102s to find it and protect it and escort it home. But because it was the height of the crisis, the US forces were at DEFCON 2, and Air Force policy dictated that the conventional air-to-air missiles on the F-102s had all been removed and been replaced with nuclear air-to-air missiles. The only weapons those US fighters had as they roared towards Soviet airspace were nuclear weapons. If, in that era before GPS, those two groups of fighters had found each other and fought it out, there would have been a nuclear explosion over Russia, and very likely a nuclear war. They didn't find each other. But that wasn't because the magic of nuclear deterrence prevented nuclear war. It was luck. The fate of civilization was decided by chance, by a cosmic coin toss. In evaluating nuclear deterrence, the past is not a source of reassurance. It is a source of concern. But I am not just arguing about the past. I'm arguing that nuclear deterrence will inevitably fail in the future. The proof that deterrence will fail is as indisputable as human nature and as clear as the logic of 3 short sentences. Human beings are prone to folly. No one is perfect. Human beings are involved in nuclear deterrence. We make the threats, we evaluate the threats, we decide how to respond. Nuclear deterrence isn't a machine that runs quietly without our intervention. We are involved in every step. So if human beings are prone to folly, and if human beings are involved in nuclear deterrence, then nuclear deterrence is inherently fallible. It will fail. Quod erat demonstrandum. One day our luck will run out, and we'll end up in a devastating war. It's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. The theory of nuclear deterrence is based entirely on subjective evidence. Nuclear deterrence seems to have failed already in the past, and human nature necessitates that it will fail in the future. Nuclear deterrence cannot be perfect over the long run. The consequences of failure are unacceptable. Therefore, we cannot continue to rely on nuclear deterrence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ward. Before we move to Q&A, I would like to ask our panelists if they would like to first comment on what their colleagues said and perhaps open the debate this way. So, Matt, please.
Well, thanks, Michael. Some really interesting, thought-provoking presentations from my co-panelists. A lot of thoughts, but I think I'll just make two comments on Ward Wilson's presentation at the end. So first on, do we have scientific evidence about how deterrence works? This isn't physics, but there are steps in this direction, serious social science work to try to measure and evaluate deterrence. I've been involved in some of these projects. I've edited a number of books. I think Harrington mentioned this, trying to use kind of econometric tools, measuring outcomes in international politics using econometric analysis. So I have a lot of data, but just one that I think is particularly telling. There's this data set that a colleague of mine, Todd Sexer at the University of Virginia, put together called the Militarized Compelling Threat data set. So he goes from 1816 to 2000 and counts every time a country has issued a military compelling threat against another country. So basically trying to force a country to do something it wasn't already doing with the threat of military force. And so I was interested in how nuclear weapons might affect these compelling threats. So I took Professor Sexer's data set, and he also codes whether these threats are successful or not. So I took his data set and just looked at the threats made by nuclear armed states from 1945 to 2000. According to Professor Sexer's data set, nuclear armed states have issued 49 compelling threats since 1945. Now I was interested in the nuclear balance of power. Guess how many of those threats were made against countries with more nuclear weapons, and guess how many of those threats were made against countries with fewer nuclear weapons. 49 to 0. Every time a nuclear armed state is issued a militarized compelling threat, according to Professor Sexer's data set, was either against a non-nuclear state or a state with fewer nuclear weapons. A nuclear armed state has never sought to challenge a country with more nuclear weapons. So maybe it's chance. Maybe we got heads or tails 49, we've got heads 49 times in a row, but I think more likely it suggests that the nuclear balance of power does matter for deterring these kind of compelling threats. The second point is, often in foreign policy, we're choosing between bad outcomes. I think a lot of people on the outside who don't work in foreign policy think that maybe there's a good outcome and a bunch of bad outcomes, so why do our leaders keep choosing these bad outcomes? But that's rarely the case. Almost always you're choosing between bad outcomes, and the question is, what is the least bad outcome? So I think Ward made some compelling points about the risks of nuclear deterrence, and I agree with a lot of them. I think there are real risks of nuclear deterrence. I think there is a risk of nuclear war, as long as nuclear weapons continue to exist. The problem with the argument, though, is that there's no viable alternative. It doesn't follow that we get rid of nuclear weapons because there's risk to deterrence, because getting rid of nuclear weapons has its own problems. Namely, as I pointed out in my presentation, it's not possible without a fundamental transformation of the international political system. So if that's not an option, then relying on nuclear deterrence is the only option we have, despite the risks. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Harald, would you like to comment?
Well, I would have said no 1 minute ago, but I'm just a bit confused by what Matt just said. I had not supposed that nuclear deterrence works in a way that one nuclear weapon state utters a threat against another nuclear weapon state. If it works, would it not have to mean that a state armed with nuclear weapons, independent of the numbers, has not to succumb to a nuclear threat, or is not threatened at all because of the risks involved in such threats? I'm terribly confused because everything which I read about the deterrence value of nuclear weapons is, in the end, numbers don't count. If you have one against the other, you need a sophisticated arsenal with all sorts of options once you go to extended deterrence. But in the nature of nuclear weapons, in the nature of the enormous threat it contains, is that you can have finite deterrence and deter a very well-armed nuclear state with a few hundred nuclear weapons. Does this mean that at least this principle is put out of reality by the researcher? That would force me to rethink deterrence once more.
Okay, but what did you react to this?
Well, there's a long-standing debate about how much is enough for deterrence, and it's unsettled. There are some people who argue that having a few nuclear weapons, or maybe even if your opponent thinks you might have a few nuclear weapons, that that's enough for deterrence. There are others who argue that the nuclear balance of power matters, and that having nuclear superiority, having a nuclear advantage over another nuclear armed state matters. So this is an area of ongoing debate. Some of the research I've done suggests that the nuclear balance of power does matter. So I think the finite view of deterrence is incorrect. I think it is important for the United States, especially given its extended deterrent commitments, as were mentioned, that the United States maintains a nuclear advantage over China in particular, and over North Korea, over Russia, much more difficult. But if China were to build up its nuclear arsenal and achieve parity with the United States, it would be much more difficult for the United States to assure allies in Asia that we could extend deterrence to them. Many of our allies in South Korea and Japan have said as much, that they'll rely on the U.S. nuclear deterrent for now, that they won't build their own nuclear weapons, but if China were to achieve parity with the United States, that's something that would concern them.
Thank you. I guess I wanted to wait for the Q&A session, so maybe Ward would like to comment. What was that?
I'm a historian, so data sets make my head hurt. One of the problems with data sets is that they are largely about interpreting historical events. One person assembling a data set may interpret a historical event differently than someone else. I'd be surprised if, I'd be interested to look at the 49 compelling threats where the threat was always issued by the state with the larger arsenal, since that would mean that all the threats before the late 1970s were issued by the United States, since it had the largest arsenal, that Russia, China, and any other state never issued a threat during that period. My recollection about the Cuban Missile Crisis is that the Soviets did issue a few threats, so I'd be interested to see how that was put together. On the notion that we need a fundamental transformation of the political system, I don't see why. If nuclear weapons are magic, then abolition is impossible and proliferation is inevitable. If they're blundering, clumsy, outmoded weapons, bad weapons like chemical weapons because they spread poison and you have to wait till the wind is blowing the right way and all this stuff, then you don't need to do anything radical to get rid of them. They're just bad weapons. You admit that your dream of a magic giant weapon was wrong, and then you get rid of them. There was no fundamental political transformation after or prior to the 1925 Geneva Protocol that banned chemical weapons. So I know people say this all the time, we've got to change everything in order to get rid of nuclear weapons. Well, we didn't change everything in order to get rid of bicycles with one tire bigger than the other. Why would you have to change everything to get rid of a piece of technology? I don't understand. Sorry.
Thank you for that. So with this remark, I will open the floor for Q&A. As always, we will take a few questions and then let our panelists answer. And I will ask you to introduce yourself as well as your institution. So we'll start with Jenny Nielsen.
Thank you all for your presentations. Jenny Nielsen, the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Nuclear Proliferation. I have several questions, but I'll limit it to two for now. Matt, in light of the modernization plans and your argument for a robust nuclear posture, what would you advise for the U.S. and maybe some of the other nuclear weapon states to, how do they assuage those concerns and criticisms held by some of the non-nuclear weapon states within the NPT review process that they are committed to disarmament? What would you advise in that respect? And maybe for the rest of the panel, whoever wants to answer this is, what alternatives to nuclear weapons would you propose to reassure allies that are covered by extended deterrence, which is one of the concerns that keeps coming up? I'll limit it to that now. Thank you.
Thank you. We had a second question. Who was the lady over there?
I'm Alexandra Arce I'm the PNF coordinator in Costa Rica. But basically it was just a comment, not a question, and it was directed at Matthew. Because I was also confused, such as Müller was also confused, and I said, what I heard was, after Bart Wilson gave his presentation, what I heard from Matthew was, yes, there are risks, so he admits it, and then he says, the problem is that there is no viable alternative. So I know that Mr. Wilson already answered this, but I just wanted to say it again. I just wanted to comment on it again. And I think that saying the problem is that there is no viable alternative, because that's exactly what he said, is no justification. So I just wanted to comment on that. That was it.
Thanks for your comment. We have a question, Daria? Yes.
Thank you. I would like to ask Anne Harrington about deterrence by denial, with reducing benefits and increasing costs. And if you see nuclear weapons as this kind of a trading instrument where you try to get diplomatic benefits, we see Iran with maybe nuclear weapons, we see North Korea with nuclear weapons. I mean, in the future, this problem becomes unmanageable, I think, if you see countries looking for diplomatic benefits, not military deterrence or any security program. So how do you see the question of proliferation of nuclear weapons, and is the end point of this development that everybody has nuclear weapons when they lose the denial effect?
Thank you, Daria. So we'll start with Matt with one question, one comment.
Well, the question on how do you maintain nuclear deterrence, but also maintain adherence to the NPT and Article 6 is a good one and a difficult one, because I do think maintaining adherence to Article 6 is important. And as I said in my presentation, I do think eventual global nuclear disarmament is the goal. I just think we have to be realistic about the security conditions and when that is possible. So I think that's part of the line we need to make to the non-nuclear states, is that given the real nuclear threats out there, now is not the time for the United States to do this on its own. This really ties into the second question of why is nuclear disarmament not possible now. So I mean, it starts with basic IR theory. It's an anarchic international system. States are concerned about their own security and their own survival, and many countries see nuclear weapons as improving their security. So a country like Russia relies on nuclear weapons, has moved nuclear weapons more to the forefront of its national security strategy, in part because the United States and NATO have a conventional superiority. And and so Russia relies more on nuclear weapons to offset that. You see something similar in Pakistan relying on nuclear weapons in part in order to offset India's conventional superiority. And so I think over the past 5 years, we've made about as good a faith effort as we can, I think, to move in this direction. The US President has promised the world without nuclear weapons. We negotiated an arms control treaty with the Russians. We tried to bring China into discussions on nuclear disarmament. China said they weren't interested. Russia is increasing nuclear threats, increasing cheating on this intermediate range nuclear forces treaty. North Korea is building up its capabilities. So I think the United States made about as good an effort as it could over the past 5 years, and other countries went in the other directions. So if you have ideas about how to get Russia and China and North Korea to give up their arsenals, I would love to hear them, but I don't see how it's possible in the near term.
Thank you. Then we have one more question from Jenny about her assurance of the Allies and extended deterrence for all the panelists, if they would like to reply.
I'll take a shot. Of course, if nuclear weapons are magic, then we can't use anything else to reassure our allies because, everyone wants magic as the thing that protects them. But if they're just weapons and the key to our reassurance is our commitment, then any old weapons ought to be able to do. Your question has embedded in it the assumption that nuclear weapons are special, that they convey a particularly magic sort of commitment. My view is nuclear weapons are a kind of suicide pact. It says, well, if things get really bad, we'll all go together. I'm not sure why I would think that a suicide pact would be the strongest form of alliance. I think an alliance that says we're definitely your friends and we'll use every effective measure to protect you that there is. The ineffective measures we won't use. I don't see why that's a less credible reassurance than anything else. And as a simple historian, untutored in facts and statistics, I look back to a world before nuclear weapons, and there was obviously a way that alliances were possible before nuclear weapons. I don't see why we couldn't then go back to that world where we. And I just wanted to say on the IR theory and Russia becoming more attached to nuclear weapons, there's a danger in. I hate to quote Smetana. If you don't read history, there are often surprises ahead. One of the things that happened in the late 1890s, early 1910s is that there was a huge rush to build battleships. Lots of nations built battleships, nations that didn't need them. Austria-Hungary built battleships. Chile, Argentina built battleships. Italy had a battleship. Russia, Japan, the US, there was an arms race. Everyone agreed battleships were the key to safety and security in the world. World War I came around and suddenly everyone realized that battleships weren't that great as weapons. They were vulnerable not only to torpedo boats, but to submarines. When World War II came around, it became even clearer that battleships were bad weapons because they kept getting sunk by dive bombers. So the fact that there is this international consensus that nuclear weapons are really terrific weapons doesn't necessarily ratify their actual military value. Doesn't mean you should necessarily, if you're wise, build your foreign policy around them.
Harald. Thank you, Michal. Two things. First of all, in response to Matt, you have a certain tendency to depict US security policy as reactive and Russian and Chinese armament policy as proactive. I think that should be corrected. We should at least recall that the slow but steady build-up towards ballistic missile defense and the whole notion of prompt global strike has an impact on the strategic balance that is felt maybe stronger than it should in Beijing and in Moscow, and has some impact on what they are doing. So we are still talking about an interactive system here, and not one in which one party is only reacting and the others are acting. In terms of extended deterrence, of course, the instinctive reaction, which we see, is to act pro-cyclical. The Russians are brandishing the nuclear weapons, so we have to do the same. I think that's folly. What I would wish to see is that NATO finds a components to say we suspend the NATO-Russian Founding Act. We suspend it. And unless the security situation in Europe is significantly improving, we will have NATO troops in the Baltic states and in Poland. We are ready at all times to go back to the status quo ante when the security situation has improved through steps which we can discuss. And we are then also ready to discuss with the Russians a renewal of conventional arms control in Europe. And by the way, we are now ready to withdraw this ridiculous view, tactical nuclear weapons, from Europe and to move forwards to a single-purpose policy. Because, as Matt said, we are conventionally superior, clearly superior. We are it in the short term, and we are it even more so in the long term if you just compare the economic power of the West, United States, Canada, plus the European Union, plus Turkey, with the maraude Russian economy that is relying on the primary sector as any third world country, and is incredibly amazed when it turns out that after a period of high oil and gas prices, consumption goes down. And prices go down, and all of a sudden the whole kingdom of high oil and gas income is destroyed. So, now, that's what I would do. Why? Because first of all, it would be a very clear signal to Mr. Putin that we are not intimidated. Not by nuclear saber rattling, not by hybrid warfare. We are not. We react in a measured way. We are ready to return to cooperation at any time. But only if he returns to playing by the rules. And we could, as a very sensible, resource-saving and security-enhancing measure, get rid of the tactical nuclear weapons at once. And also improve a little bit our image among the rest of the world, which I think we need. Thank you.
Thank you. You wanted to go ahead?
So, before there were nuclear weapons, there was the problem of great power war. And people sat around in rooms like this and talked about how do we eliminate war, right? Well, the answer is nuclear weapons, right? We're still dealing with questions about the relationship between politics and violence. And when we talk about questions of nuclear weapons, I think it's important to remember that the power of nuclear weapons is not necessarily a bad thing. Insofar as the Cold War ended peacefully and nuclear weapons played a role in that, that's an amazing outcome. Really, I would say what the world would want, or should want, in my opinion, is to preserve the power of nuclear weapons, but to make the practice of nuclear deterrence less dangerous, right? Nuclear weapons are physically dangerous objects to have around, right? So the problem comes when you have a system in which, I think as Matt, based on the evidence that's collected, rightly points out, you do see a compelling effect associated with nuclear superiority, right? The question is not to say, or the burden, I think, for disarmament advocates is not to say that's not the case. But I like to say that is the case, but not necessarily for the reasons that Matt thinks it is, right? I think humans do have reactions to superiority, and humans do think that these things matter. So the solution that I'm trying to point out, and the reason that I'm talking about the idea of thinking about exchange dynamics within the context of this space of appearance, this space of politics that nuclear weapons open up, is that what I'm trying to point to is the idea that the power of nuclear weapons comes in some way from the fact that they make possible this space, this opening. The idea of annihilation is actually the power that comes from the US and the Soviet Union sitting down together instead of going to war. So how do we keep that open but let go of the weapons? And there is the problem of the idea that if people or states learn, we can trade on nuclear technology, but we have to have a weapon in order to trade, well then there's going to be more weapons. The interesting thing is that Iran traded successfully and they didn't need a weapon to do it. And that's the amazing thing about this negotiation. I would argue actually though, if you look at the historical record, there are lots of examples of this kind of thing happening. I would argue that Germany did this fairly successfully. We just don't recognize it because of the way in which we have an association between power and violence that's actually embodied in the weapon itself, right? So the vision of the world that I would put forth would be one in which if you truly want to disarm the world, you get rid of all nuclear technology, you get rid of reactors, you get rid of nuclear energy. Any state that has an energy program, and I think Matt would probably agree with this, also has a weapons program. And the fiction of separating those two, as if states don't trade on their energy programs in the same kinds of contexts, it is a fiction. Now, maybe we live in a world where states trade on their access to nuclear energy technology. Maybe we live in a world in which the nuclear fuel bank functions in some sense to hand out these notions of superiority based on trading. Maybe states compete over access to fuel technology. Like, I don't exactly know how the competition plays out. I do believe that states and humans need to compete. The question is, what form does that competition take? And how do we keep that competition in the realm of diplomatic practice rather than the realm of violence?
Thank you, Anna. So we'll do another round of questions. We start with Nick. Thank you for interesting speeches. The question that I had is very much linked to a few people actually mentioning deadness by denial already. And I suppose what I'm interested in, and that's the question for the panel, whoever wants to pick this up, is I think that there is a lot to believe when it comes to the, not necessarily the shift from deterrence by punishment to deterrence by denial, but rather the combination of deterrence by denial, punishment, and reward. Much of this stuff has a lot to do with the notion of rationality. And I guess what you could be arguing, and notable people have argued, such as Thomas Schelling, in relation to his embrace of missile defense systems, is that somehow ex post, as much as you could trust the Soviets, you can't trust the roads, which is essentially, for Schelling, repeatedly being asked on this, the kind of justification of the embrace of deterrence by denial, the fact that right now, part of the mix when it comes to strategic response actually needs to be missile defense systems, both ballistic and theater ones, to the degree that they were banned during the Cold War. Now, the only difference actually hinges on the notion of rationality. I'm curious about what you have to say about the relationship, what I could term commonsensical rationality, as opposed to strategic rationality. Because one of the things, and I certainly wouldn't be the only one to argue this, is that the best way in which you can keep strategic rationality is actually to be behaving in a fairly open, irrational way when it comes to common sense irrationality. I'm curious about what you have to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. We have another question from Mark Smetana, correct?
Thank you. Like Jenny Nielsen, I have many questions, but I'll limit it to two. And please don't anybody presume that I agree with the premise of these questions. I just want to have a better understanding. So, Harald, one sentence in your presentation, not the most important sentence, but one that I wrote down, was that great powers must respect each other's vital interests. Russia said that Ukraine was a vital Russian interest. Does it therefore flow that we shouldn't be so upset with Russia's military action regarding Ukraine? Ward, you made an important point about nuclear deterrence only works some of the time, therefore we must get rid of it. My question is, if the alternative to nuclear deterrence works even less of the time than nuclear deterrence, wouldn't that be an argument for keeping it for the time being until we can come up with a better system? And of course I'm referring to the world wars that you referred to as well. The system before nuclear weapons worked so poorly, catastrophically, in the case of those two world wars. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Gentleman over there, please.
Thank you. My name is Dura and I represent Maize for Peace. Due to the fact that we now know there are programs making smart bombs, small bombs, more precise nuclear bombs, does this open up for variety of other effects and aspects in the deterrence area? I mean, can my little beautiful city be attacked by a precise small bomb? Not only New York and London and Moscow. Thank you.
Thank you. I saw we have one more. Okay. Gentleman over there.
Thanks, Michal. Benjamin Tarras from the Institute of International Relations. Just a question provoked by one of Matthew Kroenig's remarks. You related your arguments to what you described as basic IR theory, and you mentioned an anarchic world in which states compete, or in which states are concerned about their survival. I mean, even at the very thin end of the constructivist spectrum, we've seen this view challenged. Anarchy is not something that just exists, it's what states make of it and what we make of it. I wonder, if we've gone beyond this basic IR theory, can your arguments also go beyond basic IR theory of the kind you mentioned, and how would you deal with the constructivist challenge and the post-positivist challenge to the kind of fundamentals about which you're talking?
We'll make answers and then we will get to another round of questions. So, who would like to pick up making a comment?
I'll go.
Okay, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. What if nuclear deterrence works better than the alternative? The problem is a problem of scale. 300 million dead in a nuclear war. You've got to have a lot of World War IIs before you can, at least 3 or maybe 4, before you can get to that scale. World War II so far is the worst conventional war that we've ever been able to have, by everyone really getting involved and pitching in and doing their best. It's not clear that every world war would be as large, since the 30 Years' War, for instance, or the Napoleonic Wars were significantly smaller in terms of casualties. So I think that the problem is that the failure is so large that it outweighs the fact that it does work some of the time. It's a little like walking a tightrope as a shortcut to get to work. You know, every day, instead of going around 6 blocks, you just take your pole and you walk across the tightrope over a 100-foot chasm, and you know, it works. It's shorter, it's quicker, it works better than going around, but the consequences are so catastrophic that if you ever fall, that it's so I wanted to say something about smart bombs. I think if we look objectively at the course of the evolution of weapons over history, and I'm sure no one is really a fan of smart bombs in this room, but I want to point out that it seems to me, and it's a subjective judgment at this point, that the trend in warfare is clearly towards smaller, smarter, more intelligent weapons, and that nuclear weapons look like an evolutionary dodo, you know, like an evolutionary dead end. They're so large, and always will be, that they look as if they're an outlier that's going away from the trend line. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to comment on Nick's question.
So the thing about the rationality of irrationality and the question of the circularity of the logic of the, I mean, this is very closely related to the idea of the instability paradox. The way that I look at this is that there is a constant loop of debate that very much mimics the way a Mobius strip operates, right? There's two sides to the debate, and as you follow it around, you flip sides and you come back out, right? So it's like you can argue in favor of a minimum deterrence strategy for nuclear weapons, but what you end up with is some sort of strategic stalemate in which there's no space for competition, right? If everyone just agrees that we're not going to keep very many nuclear weapons and you just have mutually assured destruction, there's no basis on which to carry out the competition anymore. And so you need to find a way to carry out that competition, which is what then leads to the logic of extended deterrence is requiring superiority, right? But then you end up in a situation where when you actually try to operationalize carrying out a nuclear war plan based on superiority, there's this certain illogic of the fact that at some point you have to face the fact that you're annihilating the world, and you come back to the notion that this could be unstable and it might be better to have, you know, a minimum deterrent. There's a lot of time spent trying to escape this loop, right? There's a lot of time, and you know, deterrence is such a thick and vibrant discourse. I mean, there are hundreds of pages and conferences and people who have been writing about this for years and years. It's an activity, right? The loop keeps the conversation going. It gives us something to do. It's part of what maintains this space of appearance in which nuclear politics can then go on, right? So I don't necessarily see this as a problem. I see it maybe as a waste of energy and time, and I might like it to take a slightly different form, but I actually think it's one of the reasons I got into this field, because I thought, well, this is never going away. In terms of how that links then to this question of deterrence by denial and extended deterrence, there's this interesting thing happening in terms of extended deterrence where the US was experimenting with giving out ballistic missile defense radars, right? And I think that there are certain US officials who are very self-conscious about the fact that this is sort of the wedding ring approach. I think Elaine Bund is famous for saying that, right? But basically she wants to give out a different ring, right? She wants to give the radar instead of the weapon, because this is sort of a different way of establishing and maintaining the same sort of relationship. Whether or not this move in this direction towards what would eventually become a sort of recessed deterrence, extended deterrence posture, I don't necessarily think that that's going to be successful, in part because I don't think that the science exists to can make a convincing political argument that ballistic missile technology is actually ready to do its job. I think the people who would need to come out in favor of saying that are conspicuously quiet, and also the industry that produces this stuff doesn't have very good data on which to base its claims. So there's sort of a hole there in terms of moving into this resist posture. And just, by the way, I guess I'm much more optimistic about the idea of stability under conditions of resist deterrence than it sounds like either Professor Müller or Matt is. And then finally, about small smart bombs. I guess I look at what the U.S. Air Force can do, and they can destroy so many targets in so many ways that in terms of understanding the role of what it would mean to be creating smaller nuclear weapons, I just, in some ways I can't see it mattering that much, if that makes sense. There's already, you know, on some level, the fact of destruction can be taken care of in so many different fashions that if it's nuclear, it's likely that it won't be called a nuclear weapon, it will be called something like a bunker buster, right? There'll be efforts to obfuscate the interrelationship between the tactical level and the strategic level, and if the US decides that that's the best way to do something, most efficient, then it very well could happen, in my opinion.
Just a note, and this is not directed at anyone, except it's really for everyone. Everyone in this room has said, or many people have said, that a nuclear war would be the end of the world. And I want to push back against that just for a minute. We have some representatives from Chile with us. And we in the Northern Hemisphere often forget that there are 700 million people in the Southern Hemisphere. That nuclear winter is scary, but it's a theory. And a nuclear war would be terribly devastating for Europe and Russia and the United States and probably China. But it wouldn't be the end of the world. And the reason I want to push back against this is not that I don't think nuclear war is going to be horrible and unacceptable, but because if nuclear war is the apocalypse, it is by definition out of our hands. The apocalypse is something biblical. It is something that only God can prevent. If the problem with nuclear weapons is that they are going to create the apocalypse, all we can do is pray. I don't think that's the case. I think what President Kennedy said in his peace speech, human problems can be solved by human beings. We made them, we can fix them. So just a note on the end of the world.
Thank you, Harald. Yes, to answer Mark, of course, we don't accept what has been done by a blatant breach of the rules in Europe. But on the other hand, we should look back at the etiology of this development. When we decided to enlarge NATO and signal clearly to Russia from the first moment on, that was Minister Rule's speech in London, in your place, that Russia, of course, would not become a member. We have decided for the division of Europe anymore. And with good reasons. There were good reasons for that. We had to make good for World War II, and we had to heed the calls for security of our now Eastern European allies, but we should possibly have considered where to start. And we did not. And we played the whole thing like a geostrategic game. And we have then, of course, got what we had called for. Which does not mean that with a clear consciousness of this etiology of the matter, we can accept what has happened. It's a bit, like Chamberlain knowing in 1938 that Versailles had a lot to do with Hitler's rise, but it didn't help him to make the right decision. So that's the answer. I would also say one little word to the gentleman of measures for peace. I think the answer to your question is whether your city will become a target or not is not dependent on weapons technology. It's dependent on the military and economic value of your city to a potential enemy with the capability of hitting over long distances. If your city is of such value, because let's say you have a missile factory there, which you probably won't have, then whatever the weapons technology is, the likelihood that you would be hit is very high. If you're just a beautiful center of tourism, the likelihood that you will be hit is low at any technological level. At any rate, it would be good for you if the numbers of nuclear weapons would go down steadily, because the fewer there are around, the more they will be focused on very high-value targets, and your beautiful city will escape.
Thank you, Harald. Well, I also want to address this question about the risk of nuclear war in your beautiful town in Europe. Because I do think the risk of nuclear war in Europe is higher now than at any time since the 1980s. This is something that I've written on, including Mark Fitzpatrick's journal Survival. I've been giving talks on this recently in Europe. But we've seen that President Putin is willing to use force to achieve his geopolitical aims. Just in past years, we've seen it in past weeks in Syria, in Ukraine, and Georgia. If President Putin were to do something like this against a NATO member, I think that would mean war. The United States and NATO would have to come to defense of a NATO member for the credibility of the alliance, for the credibility of America's global commitments. And the Russians are planning that in the event that they're losing a war to NATO, that they could conduct a de-escalatory nuclear strike. So the idea is that rather than lose the war, they would conduct a limited nuclear strike, say a single nuclear weapon or a small number of nuclear weapons, not against cities, but against NATO air bases, NATO forces on the ground, NATO ships, with the intent of scaring NATO into backing down and ceding the war on terms favorable to Putin. So I think, it's an unlikely scenario, but it's likelier now, I think, than it's been since any time during the Cold War. And I'm afraid that NATO doesn't have the adequate deterrence strategy to deal with this, and may not have adequate nuclear capabilities to deal with this. So I think this is where the real hard thinking should be done. How do we deter President Putin from thinking that this idea of conducting limited de-escalatory nuclear strikes is a good idea and something that you could get away with? On constructivist theory, I consider myself a little bit more of a realist, and this is maybe a debate we can have offline rather than bore everyone with IR theory. But I haven't seen much evidence that ideas on the possession of nuclear weapons among the great powers has changed very much over time. And it's interesting reading one of the great constructivist theorists, his structural theory of international politics, very sophisticated and goes through a lot of different steps. But at the end, to me anyway, it doesn't look that much different from Walt's theory of international politics. So I think different ontological assumptions, but maybe they end up in a similar place.
Thank you. So we have another round of questions. I think the first was Alan, already in the last round.
Thank you very much. Alan Mayer, Global Coordinator for Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. I want to pick up on something that Matthew mentioned a little bit earlier, but maybe some of the other panelists might be able to comment as well, and that's in looking at the choices is often between a range of different bad choices and trying to choose what is the least bad. And I think some of the discussion has been looking at whether nuclear weapons are the least bad or whether not having nuclear weapons is the least bad. And the risks of not having nuclear weapons is the possibility of aggression, war, and other political outcomes which are undesirable. I want to question that second assumption there, because if we have a look in the world, the majority of countries have decided not to have nuclear weapons. Some of those decided never to acquire them, maybe some of them because they couldn't, but many of them could have joined nuclear alliances, and they didn't. Others had fledgling nuclear weapons programs, and then decided to give those up, like Brazil, Argentina, Switzerland, Sweden. Some had nuclear weapons and reversed that decision and got rid of them, like South Africa. Some were under nuclear alliances and decided their security would be better by coming out from under a nuclear umbrella, like my country, New Zealand. So there are a number of countries who say, well, actually, it's not a choice between these different levels of bad. We can actually have better security without nuclear weapons. We don't face an increased risk of aggression or lesser relations in the international community. In my own country, New Zealand, actually now, when we came out from under the nuclear umbrella, it was like 50-50, because it was half day, no deal, without nuclear weapons, you know, we face more problems. But in actual fact, we had a greater impact on international relations by being a non-nuclear country, getting greater attention in international arenas, getting seats on the Security Council, even though we're a tiny little country. So our security, and now over 90% of New Zealanders support being nuclear free and believe that security is being enhanced. It hasn't been a question of being one bad and another. We've actually found a better approach. So I'm thinking, has there been research done on the questions, the perspectives of those countries that have decided not to have nuclear weapons? What do they feel? How do they feel that their security is provided? And how can that help those who still feel that it's a question of two bad choices? Can we see that moving out away from nuclear weapons is not just moving away from something bad, but is actually looking at moving to a better security framework, better security relations? I'm very interested if there's been research done on that and how much discussion there is on that in the academic community. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Jan another question.
Hello, my name is Jan Ruziczka and I'm from the Department of International Politics and Affairs. I've got a question for you. Now, in the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned the revolutionary potential of the knowledge available. Now, it would seem to me that revolutionary potential has always been there. And the issue with your approach is that that revolutionary potential was used in ways different than you would have liked. And so how do you answer that, right? The revolutionary potential itself is not new. And it goes back to, I think, the question that I had for Rent in the morning, where there was, of course, a range of reactions to the nuclear program. And it was resolved in a particular way, under particular historical circumstances. I also have a question for Matt, if I may. I'm somewhat puzzled by your insistence on that it would be good to have a world free of nuclear weapons, right? If only it were possible. But clearly, the answer to that, under your assumptions of international hierarchy, must be that it isn't possible, right? So why do you keep on insisting on it? I mean, you actually run yourself into more trouble than it does for you. And it would seem to be that you would be better off if you just resigned on this, and you would say, well, this is the world we have, because that is the logical conclusion of the interstate system, where there are sovereign states, irrespective of where Wilson's belief. And if I may conclude, there was a third question for him. I have a comment I think you might want to do without the historical examples and analogies. I don't think the third here is boring, but much for you, given the percentage of casualties in total populations, nor was the world probably a better place before World War I. But I'm somewhat puzzled in your overall line. You seem to repeatedly say that nuclear weapons are not magic, where there's nothing special about them. So what is it that actually makes you tick against them so much? Because I just don't see how you can reconcile this. Thank you.
Thank you, Alec. Lady in white, over there.
Gracias. Soy la doctora de Kroenig, y la doctora hace la traducción. She's Dr. Edin from Harald, and I am going to translate for her. Soy miembro de los parlamentarios para el desarme nuclear y vengo en representación de Costa Rica.
She's part of the PNND, Parliamentarians for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and she represents Costa Rica.
He sido parlamentaria y en esa experiencia encontré que los países más bien están utilizando su presupuesto para mejorar tecnológicamente su armamento.
I have been a parliamentarian, and I've seen that the countries have used their budget to modernize their weaponry.
Y en estos países también están las armas nucleares y ese presupuesto podría también negociarse como una de las, digamos, disuasiones que pueda presentarse en las conversaciones, porque esos presupuestos que se están usando para mejorar tecnológicamente el armamento incluye también las armas nucleares.
The budget that is being used for modernizing the weaponry is also being used to modernize the nuclear weapons.
Entonces también en la disuasión se debería de bajar también no solo el número de armas nucleares de los países, sino también esa cultura de estar mejorando la tecnología y poder utilizar ese dinero en otras menesteres como lo ha hecho mi país al eliminar el ejército.
This budget could be better used for other purposes, and instead of using it for this weaponry, especially for nuclear weapons, they could be used for they could be better used, like it has been done in Costa Rica, where we abolished the army. We don't have an army.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. We had one more question from gentleman in the front, right?
Thank you very much. I'm Wolfgang Rüdischhauser. I'm heading the NATO WMD Non-Proliferation Center, but I have to make sure that I speak here in a personal capacity. But NATO has been mentioned several times. I want just to put a few things at the record straight. And Harald Müller has alluded to the reaction to Russian actions by NATO in the Wales summit. And one of the points is that the reaction of NATO is entirely conventional. We haven't really evaluated the nuclear weapons posture. With the NATO nuclear posture is the same since the Lisbon summit, where he said we remain a nuclear alliance as long as nuclear weapons exist. Nothing has changed since. The entire reassurance measures to the east are entirely conventional. We haven't even suspended the NATO-Russia Council, as Harald alluded to. We have kept this channel open. We are still hoping that Russia will come back to talk. What we are actually puzzled is that the outcry of the international community, and we have seen that even at the NPT Review Conference earlier this May, is very silent. Nobody really, the NAM hasn't really accused or put pressure on Russia to come back to the international system, to respect international law. And I think that the way out is not that NATO starts to re-evaluate the role of nuclear weapons. Some people have mentioned we don't have them any longer. There is still the offer of President Obama to reduce the arsenal by 1/3 of the table made in Berlin in 2003. There is still the offer to talk with Russia about the reduction of tactical nuclear weapons. So there is nothing that has changed in NATO's policy. The problem is that there isn't enough pressure on Russia to come back to a constructive talk. And one of the suggestions I would make here is that we try collectively to use the instruments we have and bring back the discussion to the institutions where it has to be, to the CFD Treaty, to the Open Skies Treaty, to make the arms control treaties respected, and then we might even there might even not be a need for further superiority, neither conventional nor nuclear So I think there is, and there are parliamentarians here in the room, I think there is a need to really act before things get out of the hands. And I would like to see the reaction of some of the panelists.
Thank you. Let's make another round of answers and then get back to more questions.
I want to react directly to what Mr. Rudischhauser just said, provided he listens, now he does. The silence in Russia was not just only with the nun. I was quite amazed by the hearty relationships which were visible on the floor between our American and British friends and the Russian delegation for most of the conference, which of course was closely connected to the ongoing talks on the solution of the Iranian problem. It was left to our delegation to react appropriately when the Russian delegate attacked Ukraine very impolitely on the floor. So in the end, one can say we were also, the others were not. Since this is rare, I emphasize it here. There is, however, concerning the modernization of tactical nuclear weapons, meanwhile, an increasing discussion in our country and other deployment countries over the plans of the United States to modernize the P-61. And rumored discussions in the respective defense ministries and air forces to react to that by having a nuclear-capable successor to the tornado aircraft as a potential carrier. I have no idea about the realism or the reality of all this, but I just have to say that the concern is there. And of course, if that is going on, it would not yet be reflected in any NATO communiques, because we would be quite a bit before that stage. And as I indicated, I think it would be an inappropriate reaction to the situation in Europe. And I would much more like the suspension of the NATO-Russia Foundation Act to get some boots on the ground in which our Baltic and Polish allies deeply trust, and to use that as an incentive to Mr. Putin to return to the table. I'm afraid that Mr. Putin, not unlike Mr. Kroenig, returns to the table when he feels pressure. And Mr. Kroenig only felt pressure and his superiors in the 80s when the deployments had started. I just remind you of that. I don't think that Putin's mentality is way different from that.
Thank you, Harald.
Well, first this question on NATO, and you said you were going to set the record straight. I don't know if it was in reference to something I said, but if so, maybe I was unclear, because I wasn't arguing that NATO is relying more on nuclear weapons in response to Russia. I think that's the problem. I think that NATO does need to relook its strategy, because the last strategic concept was, as you know, was written in 2010, and almost all of the assumptions in that document no longer hold. The assumption that the threat from Russia is extremely remote, that there's no security threat in Europe, that NATO can reduce reliance on nuclear weapons as a goal in and of itself. I think those priorities need to be rebalanced, and nuclear deterrence must again be made a priority, given that there is a real nuclear threat to Russia, from Russia to NATO. But I think there have been a few things that have been done on the nuclear front. The United States has been, this is not NATO capabilities, but U.S. capabilities. The U.S. has been rotationally basing B-52 bombers that could potentially be nuclear capable in Europe, more than it has in the past. And also Polish pilots have flown in nuclear strike missions as escorts since the Ukrainian crisis. And so that's a new development as well. But I think there's more that should be done. On the question of what are the fundamental transformations that would have to take place in order for nuclear disarmament to be possible, I think they'd have to be pretty fundamental. And I think the state system we have has only been in place for a couple of 100 years, so there's no reason to believe it would last forever. If you could imagine some kind of other state system, world government, for example, not something that I advocate or that I see as likely, but I could imagine how nuclear disarmament would be possible if you had a world government. But as long as we have a state system, an anarchic state system, it seems like countries are going to want capabilities to protect themselves, so disarmament is going to be tough without some kind of transformation. The budget would be better used for other purposes. I think the United States, given that it provides security for itself and for over 30 of the most advanced, wealthy countries on Earth in Europe and East Asia, it doesn't have the same luxuries that Costa Rica or New Zealand does. And so I don't think that's a practical option for the United States. The United States provides global security. That benefits us all. And it would be dangerous if the United States were to reduce those capabilities. And the amount spent is actually less than people might imagine. It's only about 4 or 5, depending on how you count, 4 or 5% of the US defense budget. So I think 4 or 5% for extended deterrence to the advanced industrial democracies is a bargain. Which brings me to the New Zealand question. So I think that New Zealand's policy is facilitated by the fact that you're in a very safe security environment. You're an island, you're surrounded by water. I think if New Zealand were dropped down in Eastern Europe today or in East Asia, it might rethink whether it wanted to come under the US nuclear umbrella or not. Because on this question of nuclear non-proliferation, why have some countries decided to forego nuclear programs? There is a lot of good research on this. Alex Debs and Nina Montero at Yale are writing on this. I've done a little bit of writing. Rupal Mehta, a professor at the University of Nebraska, has done some writing on this. And basically, all the arguments are that really superpowers are the greatest force for nuclear non-proliferation. That during the Cold War, it was the United States and the Soviet Union that took the lead on nuclear non-proliferation. Since the end of the Cold War, it's been the United States, and that they have a number of tools at their disposal. So with allies and friendly countries, they provide security guarantees, they provide the nuclear umbrella. So as I said, the United States today provides a nuclear umbrella to over 30 countries. If it weren't for that, I think it's much more likely that you'd have many more nuclear powers in Europe and in Asia. So I think the US nuclear umbrella has been a major force for non-proliferation, and that's what the academic research shows. And then also the superpowers have used coercion with enemies. So sanctions, threats of military strikes, basically the package of tools we've seen convince Iran to put Kurds on its program, at least temporarily. So that's what the academic research shows, that superpowers are a force for non-proliferation.
Thank you, Matt. Gordon, would you like to comment on the questions?
Sure. First, let me just push back quickly on something that Matt said. I think you said, correct me if I'm wrong, that attitudes and ideas about nuclear weapons and their capabilities have largely been unchanged since the beginning. Did I remember that correctly?
I said that because the question was about constructivism, which is a theory about ideas and norms, and I said the way that great powers think about the possession of nuclear weapons hasn't changed in the direction of them seeing nuclear weapons as less valuable or as something that they would see as wanting to give up.
I'm constantly struck by the way in which some people, not necessarily Matt, assert that ideas about nuclear weapons have not changed. This is a tremendous disservice to the history of nuclear weapons. The history of nuclear weapons is a steady, slow decline in assessments of utility. When nuclear weapons first appeared on the scene, people said they would prevent attacks, they would prevent war, that they would make diplomacy, would make diplomatic threats absolutely carry the day, whatever. That they would divide history between the nuclear era and the non-nuclear era. None of that turned out to be true, and over time, each one of those ideas about the power and utility of nuclear weapons has had to be abandoned based on experience. It turned out that when Secretary Burns went to try to negotiate with the Soviets after World War II about the shape of Europe, having nuclear weapons did not give us unlimited diplomatic leverage. It turned out people don't divide history into the atomic and pre-atomic eras. It turns out that war is perfectly possible with nuclear weapons. It turns out nuclear weapons don't prevent people from attacking you, as the Israelis found out, as the British found out. So I think it's important to remember that the utility of nuclear weapons is a declining asset. And on the question of magic, I call them magic because nuclear believers call them magic. From the very beginning, sometimes they do it directly, sometimes they do it indirectly. Accounts of the first nuclear explosion, James Chadwick, a great blinding light lit up the sky and earth as if God himself had appeared among us. There came a report of an explosion, sudden and sharp, as if the skies had cracked, a vision from the book of Revelation. Thomas Farrell, the Air Force general, an awesome roar that warned of doomsday and made us feel that we punny things were blasphemous to dare tamper with the forces heretofore reserved for the Almighty. Robert Oppenheimer, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. So what they're saying is nuclear weapons aren't human, they're godlike. Nuclear weapons aren't our power, there's some other power out there in the world, God, religion, the universe, magic. So that's indirectly calling them magic. You can often take sentences in which people use the word nuclear deterrence and substitute the word magic, and the sentences retain their sense. It's not proof, but it's just interesting to note. But I think the most suggestive instance is when nuclear believers say that you can't disinvent nuclear weapons. You can't stuff the genie back in the bottle. Not only is this not true, it's very psychologically suggestive. It's not true because technology doesn't go away by being disinvented. There isn't a huge factory somewhere where all the old metal-boxed IBM PCs with 2 floppy disks are being disinvented. That's not how technology goes away. Technology goes away when better technology comes along, where people realize the original technology was foolish. But what's interesting about you can't stuff the genie back in the bottle is that I think it reflects what nuclear believers really believe. Nuclear weapons are the genie. Nuclear weapons are magic. You can use them. Think about all the claims that people regularly make for nuclear weapons. They've changed human nature, the first technology to ever do so, at least in the short time span of 60 years. They've changed international politics. Those are very large claims. And perhaps it's incautious to call it magic, but it's a shorthand for the kind of large-scale claims that are not necessarily supported by concrete evidence.
Thank you, Warren.
First, I always find it so funny when people say the nuclear budget is only 4 to 5% of the budget, as if that makes nuclear weapons cheap. When really the U.S. just has an insanely ballooned defense budget because of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Like, it's not actually that nuclear weapons are a cheap form of security. It's actually just that the U.S. has impoverished itself and spent way too much by employing the use of force when other methods might have produced outcomes that might be more desirable at less cost. So this question, I want to link the question about the revolutionary potential of knowledge up with the idea about New Zealand and questions about non-nuclear weapon states' political choices and the way they position themselves within the nuclear order. So, Jan, it's a very clever question. I like it. But I'm going to maintain that the knowledge is revolutionary, and the knowledge is revolutionary for 2 reasons. Number one, I do think that the nuclear condition is a unique era, and I do think it is a condition. It's not it's not conditions. I do think that the fact that that humankind can now instigate its own destruction is something that does fundamentally change the human condition. And so understanding behavior under that condition is something that actually we didn't have information about before it occurred. It's why questions about whether or not nuclear coercion work, now that we have half a century of data, we can ask questions like that and look at it. Another way in which this knowledge is revolutionary is that insofar as states have been making decisions about how to position themselves within the nuclear order, it's very easy when, for national security reasons, decisions are being made and there's no access to how or why or the rationales because the archives aren't open. And to read security and strategic logics onto and into the policymakers' minds. And so one of the things that I think is a very big flaw of the kind of literature that Matt was referring to is precisely that it does this, in effect, right? It basically says, well, nobody has any evidence really to refute the claims that they were behaving out of these strategic logics. And these strategic logics are so seductive. It's so much easier to get up and tell a story about strategic reason because you can apply that almost anywhere. Whereas when you look actually then at things like the Nuclear History Project, where they now are going to the trouble and expense of writing the histories of non-nuclear weapons states' decision-making, what you find out is actually the Non-Proliferation Treaty does have a meaningful effect in terms of how states choose to position themselves vis-a-vis the discourse. That's something that the strategic literature has been, as of yet, unable to capture, and I would say that has a lot more to do with the fact that nobody had access to the kind of data or history that they would need in order to tell a different story. And but I think the conversation that's going on right now is very much just sort of an exhibit of exactly this tension between the idea that some of this data can be very conservative in terms of saying, this is how it works. Don't do anything else. Don't try anything else. That could be dangerous. I mean, this is Matt's point in his talk, which he made very eloquently, versus an idea that there's always already another story at work if only we have the ability to uncover that.
Thank you. We'll take another round of questions and probably the last one in the order that was there was a gentleman in the very right. Yes, please.
Hello. Yes, my name is Harald. I'm from Metropolitan University. I'm a BA student, so I guess excuse my shallow knowledge if I insult you indirectly, I think. But first of all, I love the enlightening exchange between the panels, so thank you for that. Now, briefly, my question is directed at Mr. Matthew in regards that you mentioned several times that nuclear disarmament completely is possible to achieve with a radical change of the international political system. Now, taking into consideration Mr. Wilson's point about the advent of new tech rendering the previous one irrelevant, like with the bicycle and whatnot, what do you think what do you consider as that radical change in the international political system? How about like the strategic defense initiative of Reagan, the reinitiation of that, or rather the continuation, so excuse my ignorance of that, or things like the cyber realm, the advent of the cyber realm. Do you think those two things are part of this radical change that you would consider that would render nuclear weapons irrelevant? That's my question. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Next on the list I have is also Kroenig.
Yes, thank you. I do agree with the idea that knowledge is important to change things, absolutely. But in the meantime, we need also to build up the conditions conducive to the change that we awaiting change. As you know, the humanitarian impact injected a new sense of urgency to nuclear disarmament because they are saying with the knowledge we have nowadays regarding the huge impact of nuclear arms on the humanity, we need to ban them because of the accumulated knowledge. But in the meantime, the security, the international security architecture is still practically the same, although there was some new ones like security law, but it still doesn't enter into force. And we have, in the meantime, the nuclear weapon-free zones in several regions, entire regions, by the way, which is also sending a very strong message to the nuclear weapon states, saying that although maybe we have some umbrella somewhere, we don't need anymore this kind of arms to protect us, since we declared our region free of nuclear weapons. But nobody is taking into consideration this very strong message that we can consider, with the knowledge we have and some willingness from those who have no force to impose conditions conducive to a change, we still in the same situation, and hopefully. But my comment was related to my colleague is absent, I'm sorry, but I was talking with him, and he was saying that there is, he presented his way regarding NATO. But NATO is sending a message through his strategic concept on security, on nuclear security, adopted at Lisbon Summit in April 2010, relying on nuclear deterrence. Then you can imagine this kind of strategic concept on all the efforts aimed at freeing our world from nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next we have Lady here.
I am Denise Pascal Allende. I am the Vice President of the Chamber of Dignity from Chile. I am a political woman and not a scientific one, so my point of view will be different from some reflection of scientific. I asked Alexander to translate me because I don't speak so well English. It's very difficult to me sometimes to explain all the things I can see. So I read them. I asked Alexander to say, I have three things to say. One, to Matthew, to acceleration, something that you say. Second, the word and question of what you say, what is the reflection. And the last one is a reflection at the finish when Alexander asks your question.
So the first part was for Matthew, and it's because you answered one of the questions by saying that you the US provides global security. So that kind of shocks us a little bit, because we are under the Treaty of Tlatelolco, which was signed in 1969, which makes us a nuclear weapons free zone. So we don't really need that global security, with the nuclear weapons. So we just wanted to let everyone know that that we are under this treaty, and that the organization that is in charge of this is called OPANAL, and that we don't really need this global security through nuclear weapons. Next would be the question for Ward Wilson. And the question is, well, you have had a lot of experience. You have given many speeches and gone to many events throughout the world. And basically, the question is, have you seen any real impact from your ideas, from what you have been exposing? Have you seen any political impact? And third, okay, she wants to say.
The third one I can say in a very medium English, but I think that we can speak many things about the nuclear war in different countries, in all the world, the global world. But if we don't do it first, trying to make the little child, the school child, begin to see what is happening in the past of the women with nuclear war and looking them to the future, what is happening to them, I think that is very difficult to change the look, to the mentality of the person, to change what we want to do, what arms or words in the world. How you see that kind of doing? Because we can go to many scientific parts, to many political parts, we have many events of that, and also we see that the country can to prepare them with that kind of arms. So that is I want to see here.
Thanks for your questions. And the very last question, gentleman in the very back.
Andy Neidecker, IPBNW board and Basel Peace Office. I'd like to know from the panel, as there are several civil or many civil society projects going on to abolish towards the ultimate goal to abolish nuclear weapons. Among one of them is the ban treaty, and I wonder if how the discourse and the arguments would change if a ban treaty was being enacted. Could the panel speculate on this question? Thank you.
Thanks for your question. So I will let my panelists answer the last round of questions before we wrap it up. So, I don't know, we start with Matt, I guess.
On the CTBT, the technical people I talk to in the United States say that they're confident that they could maintain a nuclear arsenal without testing. So as long as that's true, I would be supportive of the CTBT. It's been something that's been controversial in the United States, but you know, it's speaking for myself. It's something that I think would be a good idea going forward. On the question of disarmament, in case I wasn't clear, I'm skeptical that disarmament is possible. I think it's basically not a viable option at the present or for the foreseeable future. So it's just kind of an interesting intellectual exercise to speculate what would have to change for it to be possible. So one I suggested was a change in the international system, maybe the creation of a world government. But you raised a good point too. Maybe there'd be some kind of radical change in technology. So if you could think of another capability that had the exact same or similar characteristics to nuclear weapons, the ability to deliver large amounts of firepower in a short period of time, perhaps that could come to replace nuclear weapons. Although, you know, maybe then we want to try to get rid of that capability. I'm not sure it would be an improvement. The other one would be a perfect missile defense shield. Perhaps would render nuclear weapons obsolete, but again, we're a long way from that. So I don't see any of those things on the horizon.
Harald?
I want to address two things. First, a reaction to what Matt presented as the evidence from academic research on deproliferation. I've done a bit of that myself, and together with a colleague arrived at quite different conclusions. The superpowers are not the best non-proliferators because the way they stimulate fear in countries to which they are opposed can serve as well as a motivation to try to get nuclear weapons, as their guarantees can serve as motivation not to try to get nuclear weapons. And on that may be just the case of our own country. When the US was still vastly superior in nuclear armory to the Soviet Union in the mid-50s, and the nuclear guarantee in the NATO context under massive retaliation was the highest ever. my country concluded a secret treaty with Italy and France to make the bomb together. And it was not the superpower guarantee which prevented us to go forward, but Charles de Gaulle coming to power in France and scrapping this agreement on the second day in office. We continue to have doubts about the reliability of the US nuclear guarantee, which is why we bet on a multilateral nuclear force in the early 60s, in which Germany would participating. This did not realize, and in the end we got flexible response in the nuclear planning group and the nuclear role of the German Air Force. The doubts never ceased to exist, but the thinking about nuclear weapons changed tremendously. The Non-Proliferation Treaty gave an impetus for change because for a new generation of German diplomats, the NPT was a matter of fact and nothing against we would oppose anymore, which we did before 1968. Nuclear energy got into disrepute, and in the end we found even the nuclear role of our Air Force dispensable, and would have dispensed it was it not for the resistance of a couple of allies. So first of all, the superpower guarantee did it not all. Even so, we are usually quoted as a country where it had the greatest impact. Secondly, ideas played a role, not the least the norms of the NPT. And thirdly, generational change played a huge role. The second thing I want to address is Andinidia's question on the impact of a nuclear weapons ban treaty. I think the main impact would be that civil society organizations in the nuclear weapon states would have an additional reference to try to turn the policies of their country around. Beyond that, in the predictable absence of the nuclear weapon states and most of their allies from the treaty, I think the overall impact on nuclear disarmament would be rather limited. I have one concern if this talk about a very short and unsubstantial ban treaty, just nuclear weapons are to be banned. Here is a depository, here is the entry into force conditions. That would be all. I would be concerned about countries going to the treaty and leaving the NPT as an unequal and therefore unjust treaty, which would leave us in many countries without verification, which would open a question of withdrawal, because of course from a ban treaty one could also withdraw, and all the rest. And for that reason I don't believe in the simple treaty. I think that if there is a ban treaty that has any legal standing, it would be as complex as the draft nuclear weapons conventions of the 90s, of which there were several versions, and these were quite complex and long treaties.
Thanks, Harald.
So the question that deterrence answers is this idea of what's the solution to nuclear war, right? This is also the question that disarmament answers. Both deterrence advocates and disarmament advocates are trying to prevent nuclear war. The problem is that they have two different answers to it. And one of the things that I think has been a strategic mistake on the part of the humanitarian initiative is that making arguments about how horrible nuclear war will be doesn't necessarily do anything to dissuade deterrence advocates from the idea that they have already found the solution. The more horrible you make nuclear war, the more necessary maintaining nuclear arsenals is in order to make sure that that outcome doesn't happen. And so, insofar as there is good work, which I think that there is, politically what, in my observation, is most effective over time are not arguments about the future. They're arguments about what arsenals are doing to our world today. So the Limited Test Ban Treaty moves forward because it's in the strategic interests of the great powers, but also because there is a massive worldwide movement against the environmental effects of testing. Another place where it's possible to collect information in the US now that it wasn't before is around the effects of radiation. The US is the most nuclear bombed country in the world. Right? The US has tested more devices on its own soil than any other country has. It's also possible to see these effects now in Kazakhstan and in the former Soviet Union. The hard thing about this is, of course, doing the work to establish causation associated with the environmental contamination from testing, right? There's all sorts of scientific debates about whether or not you can actually establish a causal link between some of the sicknesses that that people attribute to radiation effects and the actual events. So one of the things that I always say is that in some ways collecting information about how horrible nuclear war is only makes nuclear weapons seem more powerful. Whereas collecting information about how they pollute our today's world or reasons that they're expensive and undesirable just to have around is a more effective argument about reducing the numbers. So how this relates then to the politics of the ban, I would say similarly, as long as nuclear weapons serve the strategic interests of the great powers, a ban is going to be fairly ineffective. And one of the biggest differences between the chemical, biological weapons and nuclear weapons is this idea of scarcity and durability, right? So what we saw was as soon as there was fear that actors who wouldn't play by the rules of the deterrence game, i.e. they would refuse to behave in a rational manner, as soon as there was fear that they would have the weapons, you saw people who spent their careers as realists advocating deterrence, all of a sudden saying, oh no, nuclear weapons are bad and scary and not good anymore, right? So I think a ban is effective if you have already undermined the strategic interests of the great powers, even if, as I've already said, there is effective evidence as to why nuclear weapons aren't good to maintain. I still don't think that the ban will be effective in moving forward. I think basically there needs to be offensives on multiple fronts, and that there is a lot of room for debate about the strategy behind these things. So Jan has a working paper on this that I think is scheduled to be discussed later that I thought was really excellent. And I feel like one of the things that the deterrence community has going for it is a lot of academic muscle, like tons of people studying deterrence, making theories, testing them. They have so much literature to point to. Whereas studying disarmament has never really been done on a large scale in the US academic institutions, and it's actually very hard to get a job doing that. So I would also just say that I think that this movement needs to happen at multiple levels of analysis and multiple places.
I just want to say I believe I'm an advocate of studying history. I think it's important to do so, and I agree with Anne and Renz that I think there's valuable historical data that we haven't dug into that can give us useful insights. I think a ban treaty is essential because nuclear-armed states will never stop to pause and reevaluate their nuclear policy short of a nuclear war unless there's some viable political pressure on them. And as far as I can see, a ban treaty is the only potential source of political pressure on nuclear-armed states. It's essential. I think fundamentally this is a problem that's in our heads. we've constructed nuclear weapons for the most part on very few facts. We've built them out of subjective data. It's the extent to which there are few underpinnings of the field in terms of actual fact is kind of appalling. But the fact is that fields that have very little data are subject to paradigm shifts. Ptolemy said that the Ptolemaic system said that the way the universe was organized was that the Earth was at the center and everything revolved around it. They had very few pieces of data to build their system from. They had the Earth, Moon, and 5 visible planets. The Sun, Moon, and 5 visible planets, so 7 pieces of data. And they came up with a theory, and it was the accepted wisdom for 1,500 years, 1,000 years. It was taught in universities. People said very solemnly, oh yes, the Earth is the center of the universe, blah, 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 blah. And people wrote it down. Earth is center of universe. 1,500 years. Copernicus came out in 1543, I think, and said, no, the sun's at the center. And within a few years, everything had changed. Paradigm shift can come very rapidly. When the problem is stuff that's in our heads, you can't have a paradigm shift in a field with a lot of facts. You know, a field like construction engineering, where you build buildings and then you see if they fall down, and you build lots of buildings and you have lots of data. But you can have a paradigm shift in a field where you're just kind of weaving a few facts together. So I think the bad news is that there hasn't been much movement. The Scottish Parliament has debated some of these issues thanks to Bill Kidd, who's Chief Whip. There's a possibility that there's a French presidential candidate who's going to run in the next election who will talk about these issues because of Jean-Marie Collin's work. You know, there's been, I had a chance to speak at the Foreign Ministry in Costa Rica because of Adin's work. So it's, there is some movement. I think the bad news is there's not very much. I think the good news is that it doesn't take very long to change minds. Once you begin to change, it's like a tipping point theory. Once people begin to change their minds, it can go very quickly. So I'm guardedly optimistic.
Thank you, Boris. So with this, we'll conclude this part of Prague Agenda. I thank you very much for attending this event. It was a really exciting exchange.